Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. Tim, Michael, Mo, and the occasional guest discussing digital analytics issues of the day. Find them on Facebook at facebook.com/analytics hour and their website analyticshour.io. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 133. In the earliest days of analytics, we used the log files generated by the web server as the underlying data set for reporting. As time went on, we were able to get more data and interesting data using JavaScript. And by 2005, it became pretty much the norm for most companies to use that method. Well, here we are in 2020, and with page speed being the ever-banging drum on this Viking ship we call the internet, we're going back to server-side technology, but this time with APIs calling each other up and sending information without adding code and wait to the page that the visitor is on. So, Mo, are you more of an IIS or Apache log connoisseur?
That's just mean. That's just such a brutal way to start.
I just want to, what that question is for is not to make you feel less than Mo, but to recognize that we've come from a long way. And actually, a lot of people are grappling with this for the first time in lots of different ways. So it's just good to know all on a different spectrum. Tim, you excited to relitigate what was a fun part of the Yahoo forum of old?
I'm looking forward to it. I mean, it was different because the first thing you used to have to do with the web logs was basically strip out all of the image request, like 95% of the stuff. You had to have all your rules to just like rip it out. And if nothing else, server side
hits.
Yeah.
How many hits did we get?
How many hits? And people intuitively meant hits to the web page, but then the analysts would be like, well, that one web page generated 47 hits.
Well, since I added 37 spinning flaming skull GIFs to the bottom of every page, we get lots of hits.
In our hit counter.
I'm Michael Hobling, and I know how to raise your hits. All right. Well, obviously, we needed a guest, someone to help us sort out the what's what when it comes to server-side versus client-side tracking and data collection. Mike Robbins is the CTO and co-founder of Poplin Data, and he's held senior technical and data science roles at University of Sydney and Bauer Media, as well as other companies. And today he is our guest. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
All right. So why are we back doing server-side analytics? What's happening in our industry that's driving this?
Well, I don't think we ever stopped. I think we hit a point where we went, okay, let's do everything client-side, but we've never really stopped doing anything server-side. So when I first started in web analytics in a very informal capacity, the first kind of tooling that I think a lot of people use was server-side analytics. You know, it was log file analysis. It was stripping out images. It was stripping out CSS files. So one of the first tools I used was AWStats. And this year that's going to become a 20-year-old tool. It's still around, apparently. I did a quick Google and it's still being released. And that really was the state of the art. It was generating, your bar graphs. It was generating your hits. It was generating beautiful multicolored three-dimensional pie charts. And I don't think that world's ever left. So I think we're still there. I think we've been biased a little bit by the prevalence of JavaScript and going, look, we can do everything in JavaScript now. We don't need to do this complicated server-side code. But I'm not convinced that we've ever left that world. The pendulum's just swinging back in the opposite direction.
I feel like there are plenty of people who entered. I mean, there definitely were AWS Stats users, and there may have been people who were, cranking away on some of that. But I think there's a huge portion of people who are full-time digital analysts today who arrived in the industry and immediately were learning about client-side JavaScript and tagging, and they sort of know.
Look, here's me over here. One of those exact use cases.
So I think like saying that it didn't go away, it doesn't mean that the technology wasn't still there and there weren't users who were on it, but there was like so much excitement of all these wonderful things that could be done with page tags. And I don't think at the time any of us really stopped and realized that client-side tagging was a big ass hack to the internet, right? It was a clever hack and it offered so much upside that it never really occurred to anybody that, you know what, the fact that we're kind of piggybacking on the way the internet works means this could come up and bite us in the ass at some point 10 or 15 years hence, I think.
Yeah, I think it was that explosion of novelty. And I think a lot of that was driven by people seeing JavaScript for the first time. You know, everyone who had come from these static HTML pages with your rotating GIFs and your GeoCities websites. And all of a sudden you could do all this amazing stuff with JavaScript. You know, you could move people's mouse, you could have a little pop-up, you could do all this amazing stuff. And I think part of what fell out of that was, okay, now this provides an opportunity to do analytics in a very different way to the way that it's been done traditionally.
So why are we going away from that wonderful?
Yeah. I mean, that's where I'm at. Like, everyone seems to be talking about server side. So what is driving that?
I think there's a lot of different answers to that question. I think the main thing driving it at the moment is probably not the best reason, but I think it's one of the biggest things driving it, which is the way that ad tech has kind of flourished and the way that things like ITP, intelligent tracking protection, and enhanced tracking protection have basically come up. I think that seems to be one of the biggest drivers. It's not necessarily the right driver, but people are now looking for an alternative to go, okay, all this stuff we've been doing on the JavaScript traditionally, whether it be in MarTech or AdTech, has worked brilliantly up until now. All of a sudden, the notion towards privacy is starting to change, and we're becoming more and more considerate of, you know, what about the performance of the browser? What about the performance of what the client's device actually is? How do we move some of that performance to the server instead? But I think fundamentally it's still being driven by privacy and the fact that some of the things that were working fine in the past have suddenly stopped working, and there's lots of people who aren't happy about that.
Yeah, and I would tack on an additional reason that happens. Maybe it's just more common for it to happen here in the States, but SEO is a big reason why companies are concerned about this.
For performance?
Yes.
Okay.
Because the speed of your page is a huge ranking factor in SEO. And there's all these studies and people have done that said, you know, how fast your page load also impacts your conversion rate. So people really believe that if I load my page extremely fast, then my conversion rates will be higher. I will rank higher in Google. And so IT departments everywhere have these metrics of, we have to get the page speed below this rate, or, you know, speed to first, whatever it's called, display or whatever. I don't know all the right words of like how the browser breaks everything down, but basically like those all have these numbers associated with them. And so suddenly we come in and we're like, hey, we'd like to load up another pixel and remarketing tool on our page. And IT already hates marketing anyway, and marketing already hates IT. And so basically there's a fight, and basically being able to take this and put it on the server side is a great resolution step, right? So that way they don't have to add weight to the page and make it take longer for the page to show up. It helps our SEO. It helps our page speed metrics that we get a bonus on, and everybody can go home happy.
But okay, so what are because I've had this conversation with our front end engineers who, in a long thread, were basically like, we're ripping off all of the client side tracking, and I obviously was like, what the hell are you doing? That's not cool. So what are the arguments then for keeping it? Like, what can't server side do?
Look, I think a lot of the arguments for keeping it are things that you can only get uniquely from the browser or the device, and they have to be sought client side. And typically when people talk about client side, you're talking about the JavaScript API that runs within the browser. But just as easily, when you talk about client side, you can be talking about a native app that runs on a device. You could be talking about an IoT device in agriculture or something like that. And you're also talking about things like wearables as well. So often cases, there's information that you might want to know. So it could be something, you know, really basic, like the size of the browser or the size of the viewport or the position of the cursor of the mouse, for example. And you're not going to be able to get that information server side. It wouldn't really make sense to get some of that information server side. So there's a lot of information you can get on the client that isn't available to the server. But there's also nothing to stop you sending that information from the client to the server as well, which is what most tools do when they use the JavaScript API.
So can we back up just a little bit to the SEO, the driver? I'm curious how often so many things historically in our industry are something gets out as this is an impact and here's the solution, and people kind of jump straight to it. It's a fact that running server side is going to take less. It will positively impact the load time as opposed to running client side. But in practice, the investment to maybe switch to server side and the trade-offs on what might be available in data and the actual impact on page load performance combined with how that actually tracks down to SEO. Has that been quantified? It feels like the way you articulated that.
We've just done a test on it, which is intentionally, like, it's still using client side, not server side, but we did want to understand how the speed impacted conversion rate, which, I mean, you might think we're totally shit human beings, but we intentionally increased the delay for the variant to see how it did impact performance. And I mean, that's not like about SEO performance, that's actually about like the user conversion rate. But it was something we wanted to understand because in one case for client side, we're having lots of issues where our pages, like our redirects load too fast and therefore it's missing some of our event tracking. And, you know, someone's like, let's just slow the page down. It's like, well, that's not very good for our users. So why don't we actually test some of these ideas and see how they perform?
That seems like the great way to kind of answer that question. I will go on record as being a little skeptical that you can take that A is true, B is true, C is true. Therefore, A plus B plus C means we have to do D. And that I don't know that that has really been, or even looking at organizations that have a slow website and they're like, we're going to switch from client side to server side. But the reality is, have they first done the assessment of what's really driving the slow speed? Like there's the opportunity to rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic, that this is a fix that is very in vogue, but it may be that, the Lotus Notes backend that you're running to serve your content might, much more expensive to address. So sorry, I backtracked because my wheels were spinning.
Well, it is always funny to run into those folks who are like, we can't put this JavaScript on our page when all their images are uncompressed or something like that. You know, you're like, really? No. Maybe we should look at that thing.
Yeah, I think there's a non sequitur argument you can make there, which is often, analytics can be really, really heavy, but it's often not the heaviest thing on pages. It's, how is the server serving response? Do you have compressed images? Are you serving third-party CSS or JavaScript or something else from somebody else's CDN that could be on, the other side of the world? So I think analytics has a part in that, but whether or not it's the number one player is, look, I agree. I think sometimes it's rearranging deck chairs when really it should be a priority, but in the list of priorities, it's probably not number one.
Yeah, but IT hates marketing and they've asked for all these pixels, so that's why it gets on the hit list.
Which could be.
Yeah, but that's the thing that like pisses me off is those pixels in our particular case are driving the revenue of the company, which is paying your salary. So, like, just let it go. Like, let it go. It's a necessary evil.
That's a really effective argument. That's a really effective negotiating technique between two organizations that have historically battled each other for.
Wait, are you being sarcastic? I feel like.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay, how would you do it? You tell me what I should be saying.
Mo, I don't think it's in the scope of this podcast episode to try to tackle this problem. We're just here to discuss the underlying technologies.
Well, but I mean, because the reality is they are. I recently found a link. I think actually, at one point, it was actually a while back. It was like Variety. Like there were so many. IT often has a legitimate case that there's such piss poor governance of the pixels that it really is cratering performance. And then again, it becomes it's easier for them to say binary marketing and pixels are bad. It's like, well, no, but maybe the 30% that ought to be cleaned up or that are particularly irresponsible.
And the real bugaboo is JavaScript that's render blocking, right? So nothing else can go until this JavaScript is done. And so historically, there were a lot more of those. I think as an industry, we've seen a lot of that clean up and we've gotten better about not letting that happen. But 5 years ago, that was pretty common. A pixel from some random third party would be just dragging the page along. And it was just like, what on earth? Why am I waiting for stats.com to load? And you're like, oh, that's our media server. And you're like, well, your media server is gone. Like, we can't have that. But A/B testing tools, still a pretty common use case for render blocking JavaScript. There's ways to get around it, but it's pretty complicated. But there are some A/B testing vendors that actually will let you set up tests server side. So there's definitely ways to work around it.
Isn't SiteSpect one of them that's primarily server side?
Yes. Historically, yeah. Okay. They've got, I think they've now updated to both ways, but yeah, originally, many, many years ago, they were the kind of primary server-side A/B testing vendor.
So can I throw in another reason that, and I just recently ran across this, that in doing some of the research on this, and Mike may be able to weigh in. I had a client where it just happened that we had back-end system data that actually included parsed Adobe data feed stuff kind of stitched to it. And with that, just incidentally, we're able to see that about 7% of the revenue for a 1 month period was no Adobe analytics data was captured at all. And this was Adobe deployed client side. And I didn't initially get what was going on. And that was the people who'd supplied the data were like, oh, well, yeah, we know that happens. Those are cases where the Adobe pixel is being blocked for one reason or another, right? I mean, Ghostery, I think, will by default block it. But they're like, our backend system is still capturing it. So they weren't an official server-side implementation. They just had their system stitched together so they could say this was a transaction clearly placed on the website. The transaction went through. So I think that's kind of an analog to, I mean, that is a server recorded thing, just not for the purposes of analytics. And so we could actually point directly to what the gap is in revenue that Adobe, where in that traffic wasn't being tracked at all. So is that another case where if you're firing stuff server side, you're capturing more of it? I mean, it's kind of, maybe that's a cousin to the blocking and privacy, but if people are interacting with the website in order to get the web page to return the content to them, that sort of data can be captured server side because it's happening off of the client's browser.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very common use case for transactional data in e-commerce, particularly, is people do try and do it on both sides of the equation. So you have the client side activity and you've got the server side stuff as well. And depending on how you've implemented it, it can be very difficult to marry up those logs, or it can be quite easy depending on how that's been implemented on both ends.
Can you describe the very easy versus very difficult? I can imagine the very difficult very easily. I can't imagine the very easy.
Sure. So the very difficult is you've got a set of server logs sitting there, and they might have a user ID associated with them and a timestamp associated with them. And then you've got your client side stuff there, and that's also got a user ID and a timestamp associated with them. So if you want to do a very naive kind of stitch, you can stitch on those two dimensions and go, look, these events roughly look like they belong to the same user, and they look like they fit into the same time frame. That's pretty difficult. It becomes even more difficult when you start to consider things like, well, I've got a standard website and there's multiple products on there, and at any one stage I know that a user may have a mobile device with my page open, and they may have a computer device with my page open, and they may even have multiple tabs open. So it becomes quite difficult, even with timestamps, to see exactly what the user is doing. The easier way of doing that tends to be what a lot of systems do, particularly when measuring page performance incidentally, is to send some kind of transaction ID. So in the client side, whether it's JavaScript or something else, you send a transaction ID that's unique to that session or unique to that page request. And then you've also got a record of that server side as well. So rather than stitching on user ID and timestamps, you stitch on essentially this shared transaction ID between the two systems. So generally, you always really want to have one join key there, and you want it to be as specific as possible. And the easiest way to do that is to have something that's generated either client side or server side and then synced between the two.
Okay, so this is another time when Mo uses the show to get free advice. So what about the predicament, which I don't know, maybe facing? It's hypothetical, of course. So once upon a time, I actually talked on this show about a whole bunch of bot traffic I was getting from Boardman, Oregon, which actually turns out is not bot traffic. It's traffic which is coming from Segment. And the reason that it looks like bot traffic, well, it actually doesn't when you dig into it because it's like got real user stuff, is basically that it is back-end triggered events. So basically triggered by the system, not by the user. So it doesn't have any user context, such as their IP or user agent or all that sort of stuff. And so a lot of analytics tools then attribute that to like the user is Segment, and it creates this whole shit show. But all the engineers love it because they think that a back-end triggered event is somehow inherently more reliable than a front-end triggered event. And I just end up embroiled in this complete debacle.
So, Mo, what kind of events are we talking about? Like context data or?
Well, just Like hypothetically, if you had a subscription business and 30 days after you do a trial, automatically 30 days later, the system will trigger a payment.
Oh,
So
okay.
now the user is a paying customer. And it's not like the user goes to the website
Right.
and actually is like, I'm going to pay now. It's like something generated in the system.
Yeah. Or I receive a product return and the return comes back through my e-commerce system, but Segment will be in communication and pass that back.
Exactly. And so just for context, the issue with the analytics tools, and this is like very much a hypothesis that a few people think I'm on the right track, our user counts are completely blown out because what basically happens from a analytics tool perspective is like front end, back end, front end, back end over like the course of what looks to be like a session. And so every time you swap between front end and back end, it's triggering a new user ID because the context is different. So therefore, none of your counts are correct. So it's a big schmozzle.
So I think there's a few different aspects there. So one is that we often think of analytics events as being driven by the user. So it often helps to think of it as being driven by an agent. Where an agent is a person, but an agent could just as easily be a server or a device or a smartphone or a watch or, again, some kind of agricultural IoT device sitting in a field somewhere. As soon as you think of it that way, you then go, well, we need some way to stitch this data together. Usually it's a user ID or an agent ID or something like that. Typically, what a lot of analytics tools do is they do filter out that data or they do detect it as bots. The biggest problem tends to become either there's a user agent which they don't recognize, as in it's not easily passable as going, this user is using this version of a browser. Particularly happens with custom set user agents, but often happens with a number of other user agents as well. And then the second one is it comes from a list of known IP addresses or known IP address blocks that are known to basically be used by some sort of bot traffic. And this is the major way that the IAB, for example, determines bot traffic, and GA uses the IAB list. So it's either coming from a certain list of user agents or a certain list of IP addresses, and it goes, well, this is a bot. It may not necessarily be a bot, but it's going to flag it as one. And then regarding the reliability one, I think, are the events more reliable? Maybe. But I think the biggest problem is not necessarily reliability, but it's more around trust, which is essentially client-side events can't exactly be trusted. So if I ask all of you what your height is, what's your height?
170.9 centimeters.
Wow.
Okay, so that's a very exact example. So it's a perfect example, which is you've told me your height, and that's a perfect example of how client-side instrumentation works. Is I'm asking you for some information, you're giving to me. But fundamentally, if I really wanted to know your height, I wouldn't trust you to tell me your height. I would get out a measuring tape and I'd actually measure it. So what we often forget with client-side analytics is that it all happens in the user's browser for the most part. So they could send anything they want. It's inherently untrusted. It's end user input. It could be malicious input. It could be truthful input, but we really have no way to differentiate between the two. So if I wanted to tell you I was 150 centimeters and then I wanted to tell you 180 centimeters, it all looks the same from client-side analytics because you're essentially trusting the user that the data and the information they're sending to you is trustworthy. If that's happening in a server-side environment where the user doesn't really have any influence over the code that's being executed or the actual data that's being captured, it can be considered to be more trustworthy or reliable or accurate or whichever one of those terms you want to use. But inherently, client-side analytics is, anyone can send you anything. I can send you an e-commerce transaction for $9,000 or $1, and I can skew whatever metrics I want to. And this happens probably more often than people think it does.
So would you never, what are the use cases that you do use client side? Or you just, everyone should move to the server and that's the end of the story and I'm going to wrap up the show?
Well, look, it's always a bit of both because you can't collect everything on the server. If you want to collect, mouse movements, scroll depth, the impressions of ad units or media units or something, you've really got to do that client side. But you do have to treat some of those things with a bit of a grain of salt, particularly with regards to bots. Bot detection now is moving. It used to be very, very server-side based. So like I said, IAB, heavily based on IP addresses and the user agent of the thing that was actually sending the analytics events. Now it's getting more essentially JavaScript based and client based. So if you look at the latest version of reCAPTCHA, which there's been a little bit of talk about, inherently Google's trying to fingerprint you based on, the way you move your mouse, how long it takes you to tick boxes, how you fill things in to determine whether you're a robot or not. So it's not really a binary, should I be using client side or server side? You should be using both.
But what about all those helpful flowcharts?
Burn the flowcharts.
So to add on to what Mike was saying, I mean, as I was trying to do some prep for this, because this is a topic that it's fascinating, but I had a very, very surface level, and it's crazy how many, it's clearly a question that a lot of people are asking. And between like Telium has a detailed flowchart, and Cognetic has a post, and Segment, and Snowplow has a great post, and Blast. And a lot of those either have a flowchart or kind of a side-by-side comparison. Like it feels like it's the sort of thing that, given no resource constraints, you should do both. But everybody has resource constraints. And now, which is it that you care about? And I feel like even with the old server-based weblogs and then moving to tag-based client side, all along it was all of these are kind of incomplete in approximations. It's just that the heavy reliance on page tags, it's interesting how the data can change. We're trusting the user, I think is a good way to put it, Mike, except we're trusting the user who big chunks of the users are putting their trust in whatever browser they're using. So if Safari makes a change and a bunch of users have basically decided to trust Apple by accepting the default settings, that can change, so it's not even, it's a big chunk of people who are changing the way they're just kind of handing over their trustworthiness over to Apple or Microsoft or Google, and that can kind of swing it. But it goes back to analysts, I think, and certainly our stakeholders have that belief in the completeness and the accuracy of the data. And we want to put our head in the sand when somebody's like, this is incomplete. And there are parts of it that you will never be more complete, or it is cost prohibitive. And in some cases, it's really hard to tell how incomplete it is. If you really care, then you need to do some sort of test. If you really want to know what percentage of your visitors you're missing that they loaded your home page, then guess what? You need to go and do a server-side deployment and do a side-by-side comparison. But guess what? You're going to have a lot of challenges matching up, similar bot detection logic. So you are going to be heading down a rat hole that is very deep and dark and likely not ultimately adding value to the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes down to a business thing. And I think that's what the flowcharts tend to oversimplify as well is, when we talk about this stuff, what is an acceptable level of uncertainty to have about things? Is the level of error, is the level of uncertainty measurable? And if it is, can we measure it quite easily? And if so, you can report that. You can go, well, this is what we think the scenario is. Is this an acceptable level of uncertainty? And sometimes they're uncertain. So if we've got someone who goes, look, I don't really know how much of my traffic is being blocked by AdBlock, can we figure it out? And look, server-side and client-side instrumentation is a classic way to figure something like that out. And you can report back a number. But a lot of people just want a way to make a decision. And it's naturally human to go, I want to pretend the uncertainty doesn't exist, and all else even, we want to do X or Y and Z. So I think it's a communication thing of going, are we happy to make these decisions with a certain level of uncertainty, and how you go about decision making in those circumstances.
So if you were setting something up from scratch, you would use a bit of both depending on the use case, and you would want to measure the uncertainty for client side. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, and look, it's sometimes uncertainty on both sides, right? You can have a very good client side implementation that 5% of times or 15% of times gets blocked by a variety of ad blockers, but you can just as easily go with a server-side implementation and then discover that every 15 minutes at a certain time, there's a CDN, maybe it's self-hosted, maybe it's third-party, that occasionally goes down. Or actually, you've implemented something server-side, but 5% of the pathways where it goes through server-side, let's say it's a subscription activation, there's a pathway where the actual analytics to call the event doesn't get called. So there's nothing to prevent bugs on server side that inherently make something more reliable. You're just as easily going to run into bugs or communication issues or queuing events or something like that. but it just provides a little bit more certainty rather than eliminating all uncertainty.
On the uncertainty we're talking, I think we've been saying uncertainty, kind of what's the data that we're missing on server side. This kind of struck me, like bots we keep bringing up when implementing server side. Is the server side tracking, have they typically been trying to sort of figure out bot detection as well? Or is there a risk that, let's say you're from scratch and you're implementing and you're really just trying to see how many people, call it people, came to our homepage of our website, and I've got a client side web analytics tool and I've got a server side tool. Is the likelihood that the client side will undercount because of various blocking reasons? Will the server side likewise potentially overcount because of bots?
Couldn't the client side also overcount? Like when it something, like if it's on a page load or something like that?
Well, I mean, it could still have bots that it's missing. So bots could certainly get through
There's lots of different ways you could create abnormalities on both sides. So on client side, somebody refreshes their confirmation page 4 times. Google will be like, you had one transaction that had 4 units in it and really just had 1. And so a lot of the work in analytics is just going and doing clever things to try to figure that out. And the same with bots, Tim, basically we're just all trying to figure out how to get that out of our data. So when we see something new, and there's always new, it's a
type 1 and type 2 balance, right? And back to Mike's original point, how much uncertainty do you need to reduce? Like I had the voice of Mac Ershoff in my head that it's all about making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. Yeah. Like if your heat map is missing 50% of the traffic and, it's a heat map, it's inherently imprecise.
You don't need all the traffic to look at a heat map. The only reason you need all the transaction IDs is just because those are actual things that tie into other data storage systems that map to how much money you made as a company, which has to be pretty exact. But even in JavaScript world of collecting that data, we've always been wrong by some percentage, sometimes a pretty decent one. So 5 to 7% difference in revenue from backend systems to client side JavaScript is not that uncommon. It's just a matter of coming to sort of a little bit of peace with it.
Speaking about reliability, so use case, you have a bunch of engineers that have a KPI about something like, I don't know, number of designs created. And because it's their KPI, they decide that front end is completely inappropriate and they want to use back end event tracking because then they can be certain of it. How would you go about that conversation? Just out of curiosity.
I think this speaks less to the problems of client-side and server-side tracking and more to the point of KPIs between conflicting teams where you optimize to one at the detriment to the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, potentially. But I think it's something about like the crux of the problem to me is that engineers want to measure stuff where they feel that not that they have the most control over it, but that they understand it the best. So therefore the inherent belief is that it's more reliable, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, so Mo, the way that we get paid on the marketing side of the house is by increasing how many people come buy our products or whatever it is we do as a company. We want more of it. The thing that IT or engineers are doing is trying to ensure that the systems that are necessary to create that outcome remain reliable and stable and understood so that they can replicate or support that success. So everybody's pulling for the same thing, but in 2 very different ways. And so in IT, our job is to go in and make sure that we are up and ready to take orders when the biggest order day of the year happens, and every other day of the year we have uptime. And the marketing side, it's sort of like, how can we maximize all of our opportunities all the time and really push the envelope? And so it's almost normal that there is a tension. I made the joke earlier that they're always fighting. And even in healthy organizations, there can be a tension because we're actually doing 2 different things. One of us is out here trying to take risky actions, and the other side's job is to mitigate those risks. And so when you hear somebody on the engineering side of the house say, we want that more reliable thing, understand the context of where it's coming from is really helpful. Because, there's lots of analytics tools that get used in engineering organizations, like application uptime engineer, New Relic, all those kinds of things that people put into applications and servers to be able to monitor, what kind of load are we under right now? do I need to kick off another cloud instance of this compute thing? I don't really know all that stuff. It's all very complicated and really important because none of the stuff we want to do as marketers and analytics would ever happen if those guys in the closet over there didn't figure out how to keep our website up.
I didn't realize they were all in the closet.
I'll use that reference next time that I'm trying to convince them to do something.
Whatever. Server rooms with the loud fans, and I'm sure that's not the way it worked anymore because it shows you the last time I was in any kind of environment like that. Now it's all cloud-based systems, no more racks of computers.
So just some things that we haven't quite covered that are still a little, just to try to be really clear about it, that we now have tag management systems. Most digital analytics is deployed through a TMS.
Yeah.
But when we're saying server side versus client side, I can deploy my TMS. My TMS can actually be, where does the client side versus server side come when you're talking about the tag management system versus the digital analytics platform? To do server side, do they both have to be operating server side? Is there a both where part of that is happening client side, but then there's a server side component? Like, is that explainable in a clear way? Like, what do we mean when we say going server side? Am I going everything server side or some stuff?
I mean, usually some stuff. Going everything server side is difficult but doable, but it does mean that you do lose things in the process. And if that's an acceptable loss that you don't want to collect that information or you don't have permission to collect that information, then you can go server side, and it becomes quite easy to anonymize everything through IP addresses out at load balancer levels, do all that sort of stuff. But typically you're doing a little bit of both. So you can have server side tag management systems. They're less common because typically when tag managers evolve, they evolved on client side first. But increasingly, we're seeing more and more server-side systems. Now, you don't have to use a tag management system on the server side. There's nothing to stop you directly calling out to, measurement protocol or Adobe Analytics or Heap or Segment or anything like that directly. So you don't have to use a tag management system. What it really makes it easier to do is to proxy out those requests to multiple locations. So if you're using multiple vendors, it's much, much easier to have one place to send all those requests to once and have that third party send 4 or 5 different network requests out than it is for you to essentially do that itself.
But if you've got a pixel, if you've got something that normally you would deploy through a TMS and it would be pushing the pixel client side and then it would be deploying, like the system that's uptaking that data has to support both server side or client side. Like, could I be running my TMS server side, but now all of a sudden I've got some media partner and they say, we don't operate with server side calls. And now I'm kind of screwed. I have to have something client side as well.
Yeah. And look,
does that make no sense?
No, that absolutely happens. There's plenty of vendors who will have an API that they will fully expect that the client calls out to that API, or a TMS calls out to that API and sends a certain set of parameters. And sometimes they may well be parameters that you can only get on the client side. And that's very common with ad tech vendors, particularly when they're trying to do fraud detection and cookie syncing and all that sort of stuff. So there are vendors who do have methods to send data server side, and they're cropping up more and more now. But it's not unusual for a vendor to turn around and go, actually, we don't support that method of sending data.
Yeah. Tim, there's actually a couple of folks at your company who have done a lot of work in this space. You should talk to them. If you want, I can introduce you.
We're a growing company. I try not to interact with people at the company. That doesn't work out well for anyone.
Well, with using a data layer, which I think is probably the latest thing that's been happening in the digital analytics space, that allows you to do a couple of things and think about things a different way. And so, like the growth of, Mike, you mentioned Segment, and I think that's a good example of a company that's grown really rapidly with the rise of kind of leveraging, like, hey, there's an API, so we don't need to deploy code on the page. You just collect it when they come, send it to us. We'll take care of federating it across everybody else. And look at all the wonderful unity that we get by sending the exact same thing to 5 different people. And that'll be great for you. And they have the ability to go and collect a lot of things that you would normally see in what I'd call like your more robust digital analytics deployment today, right? So you can make client-side calls back into that tool to join it or combine it with your Segment stuff. At least that's the sales pitch.
Which there was one of so put aside the user stuff. If you're pushing onto your data layer, metadata about the page, I think I read somewhere was saying that data layer is being populated server side. The server is saying what is the, it could be the content type or something. It's like, it was saying, wasn't that kind of insane that you've got your servers figuring out what is going on the data layer, is pushing it out to the client, and then the client sitting there and reading it and passing it back? Why wouldn't you just have that collected from the server? Obviously, that works for some data that goes on the data layer, not all of the data, but a little light bulb went on for that.
Well, that's where event-driven data layers then become a really good model for both client-side and server-side tracking. So if you're up on the lingo, EDDL. Shout outs to Jim Gordon. All right. So we are getting short on time, so we need to start probably wrapping up. One thing we love to do on the show is go around the horn, talk about anything we've seen recently that we think would be of interest. It's called the last call. Mike, you're our guest. Do you have a last call you'd like to share?
Yes, thank you. So one of the things I want to share is a really interesting bit of research that someone's done last month on audio fingerprinting. So traditionally, there's been a few different ways to fingerprint devices. Often in browsers, it's looking at resolutions, user agents, IP addresses, what fonts you have installed or extensions. What this audio fingerprinting API does is kind of a workaround, and I don't recommend anyone using it, but it is a very interesting read, it looks at essentially generating an audio file and rendering that audio file on a device and using that to actually fingerprint the device. What that does is quite sneaky, because it means that you can fingerprint not just across multiple websites and multiple different sites, but also across different browsers on the same device. It's a really interesting read. It's quite technical, but it comes with code and examples of how to do it. So yeah, that'd be my one.
Very nice.
Interesting.
Mo, what about you?
Well, I have a very shameless plug, but I am plugging it because it's fantastic. And I know it's fantastic because I QA'd a lot of the content. But my sister, Michelle Kiss, has done a course on Google Data Studio, which is available at the CXL Institute. And it has some amazing recommendations by Simo Ahava and Will Pryor. And yeah, she knows her shit. Whenever I have a Data Studio question, she's pretty much the first person I ask. So if anyone wants to upskill in that, I really recommend her course.
Very nice.
Nice. You want to go next, Michael?
I will be glad to go next. As I was looking through this show topic and thinking about some things around the end of the year, I realized there are a few people on Twitter that I refer back to again and again as in terms of better understanding what's happening in this world of browsers and cookies and privacy and new emerging regulations. And so I just wanted to give sort of a little last call to highlight a couple of those. Obviously, most of our listeners are familiar with Simo Ahava, who's been on the show. And Tim, I think your last episode was about a new site that he put up about browser tracking. I forgot the name of it.
It's cookiestatus.com.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. And so anyone can contribute to that. So there's three people. Zach Edwards, whose Twitter handle is @TheZEdwards. He is prolific in terms of those kinds of stuff. There's also Arvind Narayanan. I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, so I apologize if I'm getting that wrong. @random_walker. He's a professor at Princeton who does quite a bit of research into privacy issues and things like that. So really great guy to follow. And then the last is Serge Egelman and his @V0Max. And he does quite a bit of stuff on, privacy and cookies and stuff like that. So those are the ways that I stay informed. And now they're the way that you can too, if you are on Twitter, I guess.
Very nice.
Okay, Tim, what about your last call?
Well, so I'm glad we had you in between because I'm going to actually go with one that I also did some degree of QA on. I recently, Brent Dykes, who was on episode 42 way back when in 2016 of this show talking about data storytelling, has a new book out called Effective Data Storytelling, How to Drive Change with Data, Narrative, and Visuals. And I got to, as he was writing it, I was getting to kind of get a preview of each chapter as he was getting them written. I look at it as kind of a cousin to Nancy Duarte's book. His is a little bit denser, but it goes through a lot of kind of historical examples and kind of ties them into specific concepts that you can kind of use as you apply. There's some overlap. A Venn diagram of the two books would actually have a healthy overlap, but it's a darn good book and I recommend it.
Very nice. Okay, I am sure you've been listening and you've been thinking, Oh, client side, server side. This is the argument I've been waiting 15 years to re-engage in. Go ahead. We'd love to hear from you. The best place to reach us is on the Measure Slack or on Twitter or our LinkedIn group. And we'd love to hear your comments or questions about the show. Also, we are delighted that we will be in 2 weeks in Budapest at Super Week. And so if you're coming to that, tickets may have already sold out, but you will see us there. You could at least double check, or if you know somebody, maybe give them a ring and be like, hey, hook me up with this mysterious shadowy figure who is Zoli, and see if he can give me a hookup for Super Week tickets. Obviously, we'd love to give a shout out to our producer, Josh, and all of his great work on the show. Mike Robbins, thank you so much for being our guest. It's been illuminating.
Thank you very much for having me.
And tricky issue. I think, we will see more server-side stuff happening. It seems to be the trend. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more product offerings in the future from other people like Google, maybe even Adobe in this space. So, this will probably be something that continues to have impact to our work in digital analytics. And I think I could speak for my two co-hosts, Mo and Tim. Whether you collect your data server-side or client-side, just remember, keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, or Measure Slack group. We welcome your comments and questions. Visit us on the web at analyticshour.io, facebook.com/analyticshour, or at analyticshour on Twitter.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Analytics. Oh my God. What the fuck does that even mean?
I think we're ready to get started. I'll just kick us off, and then we'll talk for a while about something we've been talking about for 20 years. But this time, totally different.
And I just end up embroiled in this complete debacle of we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
We interrupt this podcast to
you realize this show comes out 2 weeks after Christmas. And a Happy New Year. 2 weeks after Christmas.
Well, that's okay. Points for enjoying it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
Fuck's sake. This is Jamie saying last night, like, hey, if you interrupt the show, you'll be on the outtakes. So Mum was like, wow.
Challenge accepted. I love your mom.
No, but this was me last night being like, guys, I'm recording from 9 till 10:30. 9 till 10:30, there are going to be 2 sets of doors shut. Please do not come in. Every single person in the house managed to come in. Every person.
Jamie was wearing a towel. Am I right in thinking that Jamie was wearing a towel?
He went to Aqua with my mother.
Oh.
What's Aqua?
It's like water aerobics. And apparently some of the old ladies, when they see Jamie around, because of course Mom's in it with like a bunch of women who are 70 and 90, and they're like, well, he's a bit of eye candy, isn't he?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, and I think Jamie actually secretly loves it.
Really want to stop recording, but Mo just keeps serving up the gold.
Yeah, just keep going.
Rock flag and be nice to IT.
That's a good. That's right. Be nice to IT.